After a week of heavy fighting, Israeli troops have effectively severed Gaza in two, moving under cover of aerial bombardment. Meanwhile, fighters from Hamas, which the UK proscribes as a terrorist organisation, are reported to have pulled back to embed themselves in dense urban areas. Israeli forces have almost completed their encirclement of Gaza City from the northwest, the northeast and the south. The dark red areas here show Israeli clearing operations, and the light red shading shows how far IDF troops have advanced. The IDF says that the ground troops have now got as far as the coast and bombed Hamas targets in Gaza City itself. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Sikander Kamani reports now on Gaza divided in two, and again a warning. You may find some of the contents in his report upsetting.
Writhing in pain, but still alive. What of the boy's family? So many in Gaza, now being torn apart. This is in Khan Yunis, in the supposedly safer southern part of the Strip. But it seems nowhere is safe from Israeli airstrikes. A grim milestone reached today in Gaza. More than 10,000 people killed, according to health officials. Close to half of them children.
There wasn't a single militant among them. Just a few minutes ago, I was filling their water for them. Then suddenly the whole home collapsed. They're all women and children in there.
In the courtyard of a hospital in Deir al-Balah, bodies wrapped in the white shrouds that have become so awfully familiar. Some small, some big. Tears shed for them all. And this too, far from the north of Gaza, where the fiercest fighting is taking place.
We were displaced from northern Gaza. We came here to stay with my aunt. I was just sitting there when the bombing started, and all of a sudden we found ourselves in the midst of the rubble.
The Israeli army is pushing deeper inside Gaza, killing, it says, another senior Hamas commander overnight. Ground forces have now reached the coast, cutting the Strip in two. Reinforcements and supplies are heading across the border as the soldiers gear up for an imminent and even deadlier battle in Gaza City. Hamas fighters are believed to be holding out there amidst a vast network of tunnels and tens of thousands of civilians. Israeli soldiers filmed this video in a building used by a Scouts Association, showing, they say, Hamas rocket launchers hidden inside. They blame the militants for hiding amongst the population, but pressure for a humanitarian ceasefire is growing. Addressing foreign ambassadors today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu showed no sign of agreeing to that.
We will win, and we believe that all civilized powers should back us in this effort, because this battle is your battle.
Inside Israel for now, even most of Netanyahu's staunchest opponents have put their differences aside. Nearly 1 month on, the country remains deeply traumatized by Hamas's murderous rampage and the abduction of more than 200 hostages.
So this is our central logistics center in Tel Aviv.
Reserve Naval Officer Ronan was a leading figure in huge protests against Netanyahu's controversial judicial reforms. Now he's a leading figure helping collect donations for soldiers and displaced Israelis.
On October 7th, in the morning, we all knew that there's now only one, or there are three main purposes, but one is the key purpose: help the IDF win. We have to win the war. If we want to win the war, everything else is irrelevant.
Internationally, there's a lot of concern about civilian casualties in Gaza. You have been very critical of the government in the past. Is that something that you and others here have concerns about?
I'm not the right person to ask, because I've been part of the Israeli Defense Forces for 40 years. I have all the trust, you know, in our military leadership. I think they are the best people.
But Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. Israeli airstrikes are causing untold terror and devastation here. They're desperately calling out for anyone still alive under the rubble. Desperate calls to end the suffering.
Well, a coalition of 18 UN bodies and aid agencies have issued a joint letter saying that enough is enough and that the killings perpetrated by Hamas in Israel last month were horrific, but the killing of so many Palestinians now is horrific, and there must be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, not least to allow more desperately needed aid into Gaza with water, fuel, medicine all in short supply. Many Israelis, however, react with indignation to that suggestion of a ceasefire. They say, how can we allow Hamas to stay on in power in Gaza after what has happened here? And the officials here also say that even a brief pause in fighting, it seems that they fear that would make it too difficult for them to restart the fighting and restart their fight against Hamas because of the level of international pressure that's they're beginning to face. Underlining that, the US White House has issued a statement in the last few minutes saying that the issue of a humanitarian pause was raised in conversation between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, though officials said that they're at the beginning of that conversation, not at the end.
Sikandar, thanks very much indeed. Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Rassan Abu Sita, a British-Palestinian surgeon currently in Gaza, who's been travelling between Al-Shifa Hospital and Al-Ahli Hospital. I began by asking him why he's been making that dangerous journey and what the conditions are like in both hospitals.
So Shifa Hospital today has had to shut down 6 of its operating rooms. So that's half of its operating room capacity because of a lack of fuel. And now that the Israelis have hit the solar panels on the roof of Shifa with a drone missile, that capacity is going to diminish even further. And so what I've been trying to do is take patients to Ahli Baptist Hospital to help decrease the pressure on the beds at Shifa by operating on these patients. So I take 5 or 6 patients per day. I come here, I operate, and then every second day I go back to Shifa and try to get some more.
And of course, Shifa is in the middle of Gaza City, and I gather that there's fighting all around, so that must make it even more difficult.
The trip by ambulance between the two places, you drive by several buildings that have been hit by the Israelis and have been completely demolished. The heartbreaking thing is that some of them, when you drive by, there is a stench of decaying bodies coming from those buildings. Last night, I slept at Shifa, and overnight, we received 500 dead, hundreds of wounded. The hospital was engulfed by dust and smoke and the smell of gunpowder repeatedly last night.
And last night was apparently the heaviest night of bombardment since the beginning of the war, despite calls on the Israeli government, including by the Americans, to slow things down a bit. Describe what that night was like.
Basically, the whole building from its core would shake. Because they had also switched off, the Israelis had also switched off all of the communication lines. The ambulances were just blindly heading in the direction of the bomb because there's no way to communicate. And so we went to the emergency department, and it was scenes of absolute carnage. And what breaks your heart, in addition to multiple things, is that every night when there is an air raid like this, you find colleagues, Palestinian colleagues who live in Gaza, frantically looking around the faces of the wounded and the dead that they're brought in, looking for relatives and even children and nephews and nieces, because their neighborhood is the one that's being targeted.
I'm sure you're just thinking from day to day, from hour to hour at the moment. Can you and can your friends and colleagues ever imagine what will happen to Gaza in the future, if and when this is ever over?
It will take decades. Well, I mean, as a as a plastic reconstructive surgeon, I can tell you that the children, who are now well over 8,000 wounded, will have a lifetime of repeated surgeries to reconstruct these wounds that have been inflicted on them. Children once wounded, as their bodies try to grow, they need repeated surgeries until they reach adult age. The hospitals, 16 hospitals have been damaged, and those shattered lives and those broken bodies. Unfortunately, as plastic surgeons, we can fix the broken bodies, but we cannot fix the shattered lives.
We hear a lot about the deaths. Tell us something about the kinds of injuries that you're dealing with.
So these blast injuries cause massive wounds, which literally rip the flesh off the body, cause multiple fractures. In addition, initially we were just seeing lots of thermal burns from the kind of flame of the blast. Recently, we started seeing more and more white phosphorus burns.
So you've seen evidence of white phosphorus?
In 2009, I was in Gaza and worked when the Israelis had widely used white phosphorus. And I mean, it's a very typical pattern. White phosphorus, because it's a chemical burn, burns in a different way than thermal burn. When the pellet of white phosphorus lands on the body, it burns and burns itself right through to the deepest part of the body, either bone or sometimes even internal organs.
It sounds horrific. Dr. Abu Sita, thank you very much indeed, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Now, as we saw earlier, repeated airstrikes have, according to the Hamas-run authorities, resulted in more than 10,000 deaths since the conflict began a month ago. All this begs the question, has Israel's response to the Hamas attacks on October the 7th been proportionate? And who arbitrates the internationally accepted rules of war? Here's our data correspondent, Kieran Jenkins.
The issue of international humanitarian law is fundamentally important. Namely, have war crimes been committed in the Israel-Hamas conflict? The rules of war have their origins in the Geneva Conventions, drawn up in the aftermath of World War II, focused on the protection of civilians. Along with more recent updates, it's been codified by the International Committee of the Red Cross into 161 rules of war. So have there been war crimes in the recent violence? Well, the atrocities committed by Hamas on October the 7th, murdering civilians and taking over 200 hostages, were widely condemned as war crimes. Rule 1, attacks must not be directed against civilians. Rule 96, the taking of hostages is prohibited. What of Israel's response? The United Nations Secretary General suggested there had been breaches on both sides.
I'm deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. Let me be clear, no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, the organisation central to establishing these rules, said Israel's siege of Gaza was not compatible with international humanitarian law. The interpretation of these laws, though, is contested. Israel says Hamas has bases in tunnels under hospitals like the Al-Shifa hospital. The rules of war say hospitals must be protected from attack, but they can lose this protection if they're being used for military purposes. And listen to Israel's justification after it attacked the Jabalia refugee camp.
About the civilians there, we're doing everything we can to minimize. I'll say it again. Sadly, they are hiding themselves within civilian population. And again, we are doing this stage by stage, and we're going to go after every one of these terrorists who was involved in that heinous attack on the 7th of October.
Israel argues its attacks are on military targets, that civilians it kills are not the target, and that Hamas uses human shields. Rule 97 says the use of human shields is prohibited. And while Rule 7 states that attacks must have a military objective, crucially, the attacks have to be proportional. Rule 14 states that the civilian loss of life must not be excessive in relation to the military advantage. And Rule 15 says that constant care must be taken to spare civilians. Israel has hit Gaza with thousands of missiles in the last month, and several international organisations say thousands of children are reportedly among the civilians killed. Who decides if these deaths were excessive? Here's where other countries come in. The Geneva Conventions place an obligation on all states to ensure the rules of war are respected. That's why people look to Israel's allies. Are the US and the UK ensuring the rules of war are respected? Also, the International Criminal Court, the ICC in The Hague, has jurisdiction over war crimes. Its current prosecutor is a British barrister intent on investigating alleged war crimes on all sides.
We have active investigations ongoing in relation to the crimes allegedly committed in Israel on the 7th of October, and also in relation to Gaza and the West Bank and our jurisdiction going back to 2014.
Israel, though, says it's not a member of the ICC and so it's not subject to the court's authority. For all the talk in this conflict of the importance of respecting the rules of war, actually upholding them is far from simple.
Kieran Jenkins reporting. Well, this isn't the first time that Israel has mounted a ground invasion of Gaza. Troops also entered the territory in 2014. One of the soldiers then who was sent back was Benzi Sanders. He says that he started out believing in the cause of a greater Israel and the military operation, but the reality of war eventually changed that. I met him earlier today and asked him to describe why he changed his mind.
I served in the West Bank and in the Special Forces unit that I was in for 8 months. And I really thought that this thriving Jewish society in the land of Israel was something that I needed to be part of. And I knew that all of that was only possible because Israel had a strong military that had defended it time and time again. That started changing when I was actually sent into the West Bank to protect settlements. And I began to understand that they were slowly expanding, taking over Palestinian land.
And did you approve at the time of the expansion or not?
I think before I went in, I approved of it. When I saw what it actually meant, and I saw that we were just imposing a military regime over Palestinian civilians, I began to question it.
You've written very movingly about your experience and your conversion, if you like, after you were in Gaza as an IDF soldier. Just tell us about what it was like to do house-to-house combat in Gaza.
When I was sent in, we were told we have to provide this perimeter for the engineer corps to demolish attack tunnels that had gone into Israel. And we were told that all the civilians had fled. It wasn't true. There was a family that we found in the second neighborhood we went into, in the Al-Bura neighborhood of Bet Hanun. Even though we were going into every house with live fire, they managed to understand that this was an innocent family and they didn't harm them. They gave them food and gave them water, and they guarded them for many days. But I found out this actually later. When we pulled out, the Air Force just flew over that neighborhood and bombarded it, and they were killed.
That family?
That family, yeah.
All along you were told by your commanders that this was to eliminate the Hamas threat. And how did that work out?
Not only did we not eliminate the threat, but actually Hamas got stronger in many ways because of our efforts. What I learned was that my government facilitated the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars, which went to Hamas from Qatar. And also, at the same time, we tried to defund and delegitimize the Palestinian factions and Palestinian organizations that recognize international law, that renounce violence.
And recognize the state of Israel.
And that recognize the state of Israel and are willing to negotiate with the state of Israel.
So why were they doing that, do you think?
What has been written and what has been stated openly by even senior members of this current government, including Netanyahu, is that they considered Hamas to be an asset. And because their ultimate goal was not to defeat Hamas, their ultimate goal was to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And it was actually convenient and useful to have the Palestinian leadership split.
And you also wrote very starkly that a land invasion of Gaza will fail. Why did you say that?
For the exact reasons that we're describing right now. I believe that the Israeli government has the responsibility to defend Israeli citizens and not to allow the horrific atrocities and the kidnappings that took place on October 7th to happen. But the only way to do that is by providing an alternative. And I'm not saying that there's no circumstances when a military operation isn't necessary, but it can't be with a government who has no plan for a future vision where a political solution.
I hear what you're saying, but I wonder whether more and more Israelis who might have agreed with you in the past care less about the ultimate plan because of the nature of the atrocity committed against Israel on October the 7th. And what they're really just hell-bent on, you could say understandably, is retribution.
I think in many ways, a lot of the fundamental assumptions that people had, that they bought the lie, that Netanyahu and his partners sold the public, that we can just manage the conflict and keep it on a low burn, because I don't think they approached the Palestinian civilians as the future partners that we need to make peace with.
Benji Sanders, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk now to Mark Regev, senior advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and a former Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Mark Regev, it's good to have you back on the program. I just want to put to you something that Dr. Abu Sita, a British Palestinian doctor, told us from Gaza a few minutes ago. He said that he was treating patients that he said had clear evidence of wounds caused by white phosphorus. Is the IDF using white phosphorus in Gaza?
No, the allegation was raised at the beginning of this conflict, and the IDF said unequivocally that that's just not true.
Well, he said unequivocally that the wounds that he's been treating could only have been caused by white phosphorus.
I can't speak directly to this person. I don't know who they are. I can only say this, that the doctors in Gaza are very limited on what they can say. We had earlier today on a rival network, we had the head of the Shifa hospital in Gaza, and he was asked point blank, how do you feel about having a Gaza military installation under your hospital? And he said, no, there is no such Hamas military installation under my hospital. Well, everyone knows there is. The people of Gaza know there is. But these people, when they're interviewed by the international media, have to follow the party line, that's the Hamas line, and they will repeat what Hamas tells them to say. If they don't, they face violent retribution, Matt. That's the truth.
There's just no evidence of that happening, certainly not in the case of this doctor.
Can I tell you, Channel 4 itself, sorry, Matt, that's not true. Channel 4 itself.
He brought it up.
Channel 4 itself ran a piece, I remember, in a previous round of fighting where you interviewed someone's shoe. I don't know if it was your piece or someone else's, because he wouldn't speak out against Hamas and show his face. And he feared Hamas's retribution. Don't tell me, when you have reported it yourself, that Hamas is brutal with its own people if they speak out of turn. That is a known fact. Don't deny it, Matt.
Well, again, I don't know about that particular case that you're talking about, but I just told you what this doctor told us. Anyway, let's move on from that.
All I'm saying is no one in Gaza can speak openly against the Hamas regime. Don't deny that. No one in Gaza can stand up and complain about Hamas.
Again, there is no evidence of that in particular cases, certainly not in the case that
I disagree. I think that's
Let me move on.
Interviewing civilians from Gaza is like interviewing people in any authoritarian regime. To not say that there are limitations on what they can say when they speak to the international media is to ignore reality.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the numbers. 10,000 deaths reported by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry. Are you saying that that number is also just a lie?
First of all, the number is, as you said correctly, provided by the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, so we don't know if those numbers are correct. Secondly, you have no idea of the distribution within that numbers, how many of them are Hamas fighters, Hamas terrorists, and how many of them are really innocent civilians. And of the innocent civilians,
well, they are saying that 4,000 of them are children.
No,
they are saying that 4,000, I think 27 of them are children. Okay.
That's their numbers, correct. That's what Hamas is saying. And then you also have to ask the question of the innocent civilians, how many were killed by Hamas munitions? We know for a documented case of the hospital in the north in that first week of conflict, which should have been, I think, a pivotal moment for people covering the crisis. It was a rocket fired by the terrorists that fell short and killed people. Are they also victims of Israeli aggression? Of course not.
Okay. You keep bringing that up every time we speak to each other, which is a lot.
But it's important. How can one not ignore that?
We did some very careful reporting on that, reflecting both sides of the argument. Let's move on. Two-state solution. This is something that the Americans are still wedded to. Is your Prime Minister at all wedded to a two-state solution still? Because I haven't heard him talk about it.
I think he said very clearly in a press conference he gave for the international press, I think it was last week, he said there is a time for peace and a time for war. And at the moment, we're in a time for war. Hamas declared war on us. They brutally invaded our country and horrifically murdered our people en masse. We have to defeat them. We have to destroy Hamas's military machine. We have to end their ability to inflict this sort of pain. And as you know, just a few days ago, the deputy head of Hamas said, we want to do it again and again and again. And so we have to deny them the ability to do so.
But I'm talking about the West Bank as well, because the accusation that I hear repeatedly from many Israelis, including the former head of Shin Bet, who we interviewed on the program yesterday, Ami Ayalon, is that Bibi Netanyahu, your boss, has done an awful lot to undermine the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and therefore to undermine a two-state solution. Has he now realized that with the Americans saying once again they really want that two-state solution, that when it comes to the West Bank, this is the only viable solution?
Well, first of all, let's speak the truth. Hamas has no interest in a two-state solution. Hamas says my country has no right to exist in any borders. I'm talking about the West Bank. Yes, okay. Let's talk about the West Bank. Isn't it wonderful that Channel 4 News can interview Israelis and get a whole spectrum of different opinions, from left to right and everything in between? And when you interview people in Gaza, they all follow the party line. Isn't that interesting?
No, actually, we interviewed plenty of people in Ramallah. In fact, we presented the program from there just last week. So we're trying to get as many opinions as possible. Just a brief one, if I may. We've just heard, I don't know if you heard the news, that the Iranian president is going to meet the Saudi leadership at a summit in Saudi Arabia at the weekend. You're supposed to be making friends with Saudi Arabia. Are you now in danger of being more isolated in the region?
We don't believe so. We're in contact with Arab governments across the region. And Hamas has very, very few friends in the Arab countries. And actually, the messages we're hearing from across the region is finish the job, finish it quickly, but finish the job, because a victory for Hamas is a victory for extremism, is a victory for all those opposed to peace and reconciliation. If we destroy Hamas, and we will, I hope that creates space for more moderate and pragmatic voices to emerge.